Hello, my name is Ed Brown. I am the Secretary General of an organization called Stefanus Alliance International, based in Oslo, Norway. I'm an American, but I've been living in Norway for about 28 years. My wife is Norwegian. My two daughters are both Norwegian and American. I grew up in a military family, so I traveled a lot. I was born in France, and then I moved to Michigan in the United States, down to Texas, to Hawaii, to Washington State, to Alaska, to California, before I ended up moving to Norway. So I grew up in a situation where I was exposed to a number of different cultural ways of being, and that sort of taught me at a young age to look at the world in a particular way, recognizing that things aren't always done one way and that's the right way. It also introduced me to the way people are treated. Not everyone is treated in the right way. I found injustice to be very, very challenging, and so that sort of shaped my view of things. And one of the reasons why I do what I do in the organization that I work for, and I will then share with you about that organization. The Stefanus Alliance bases its name on Saint Stephen in the New Testament of the Christian Bible. Stephen, as those of you who know the story, was chosen as one of the first deacons because the church was discriminating. It was practicing what the Old Testament prophets had talked about. It was trying to distribute its riches to the poor, to the widows, to the orphans, to the foreigners. But it was discriminating against the Greek-speaking Jewish followers of Jesus. They were putting them in the back of the queue, so to speak. And so the church leaders said, we need to do something about this, and they appointed some men who had a vision for serving God, and St. Stephen was one of these. So we're on the side of St. Stephen's, who are on the side of the most vulnerable in society. And that's what we continue to do today. And then, of course, St. Stephen also was a witness for his belief, and he then suffered martyrdom for that. So we are on the side of those Stephens in the world who stand up for their own faith and are suffering, and there are millions and millions of them. So Stefanus Alliance exists because people are persecuted and discriminated against because of their faith, their religion or belief. We, as an organization, are a missions and human rights organization. We have both aspects together. On the mission side, we don't send out missionaries. We've never done that. We've existed since 1967. Originally, our organization was Mission Behind the Iron Curtain, geared towards helping countries behind the Iron Curtain, the former Soviet Union countries. But we've never sent out people. We work with local Christians and churches and others. So our mission is to strengthen the church where it's under persecution. And the church knows how to be its own salt and light in its culture. We don't tell them how to do it. So we cooperate with Catholic churches, with Orthodox churches, with Pentecostal churches, with Baptist churches, with Methodist churches. That's our mission side of our work, strengthening the local church. And then also bridging the gap between the local church, the one that's under pressure, and the church in the West, primarily in Norway, who is also under a type of pressure, but it's more the pressure of affluence. How do you deal with riches? How does a church live out the gospel call to be salt and light when it has so much? And we do have so much. So sometimes bringing the faith stories from our brothers and sisters around the world to the church in the West can strengthen the faith and the faith life of the people in the West. And on the other side, we are a human rights organization, and we believe that God created everyone in his image. Everyone has human dignity. So we believe that freedom of religion or belief, our focus, is for everyone. It's not just for Christians. It's for Muslims, it's for atheists, it's for Baha'is, for Buddhists, whoever. So when we stand up for the rights of those who are persecuted for their faith, we stand up for everyone's right, no matter where they are in the world. Now our main focus is on, our projects are in Southeast Asia and also Northern Africa. But we do have one project here in Europe, Belarus, and I can talk more about when I'm asked a question about Europe a little bit later. But we exist because people are persecuted and discriminated for their faith. And we want to be the Stephens, helping them, coming alongside of them, listening to what they have to say so that they can help find the solutions in their own context. We're not telling them what to do, but helping them, strengthening them to be salt and light and to stand up for their own rights. We are a small Norwegian-based organization. We have, again, I said, no people sent out in the field, but we have 22 employees. We are all based in one office in Norway. We have a board over us. So the board makes sure that we stay on track. That's actually, I make sure that I stay in control. So I have the power as the Secretary General, but they have the power over me to make sure that I stay in line with our strategies and that the budget is met. And then over the board, we have a board of representatives that chooses the board so that it's not choosing itself, that we have some sort of accountability mechanisms in place. We are divided into different departments. So we have the international department, we have the communications and fundraising department, and we have the administration department. We believe very strongly in accountability. So most of our donations come from local people, individuals, churches, who also are passionate about what we're passionate about, helping people who are being persecuted for their faith, about 70-75%. And we believe that we need to be accountable. So we have a very strong accounting department to make sure that the money is used and that the administration costs are kept down to a low level. And then we have about 25+% that comes from the state government. So the Norwegian Ministry of Foreign Affairs, the Norwegian Ministry of Development, and some funding we've had from the Danish and the government of the UK as well. I think I already explained some of our motives. We have a genuine Christian passion for helping people. We believe that God has created us to love Him and to love others, and this is the way of loving others, is to reach out and to help them in a struggling situation. It's a challenging question to ask about motives, because while I've had contact with the Ministry of Foreign Affairs, who was the major department that we have contact with, and also with parliamentarians since I began in the organization back in 2001, there are multiple motives. Norway has always had, as a small country, a desire to make a positive impact on the world in the field of human rights. So I think the question could be taken in a long historical sense. Norway has a history of having a state church. Originally it was Catholic, but then it became Lutheran back after the Reformation. It had a strong Lutheran state church and actually practiced discrimination for many, many years. But then as it's developed back in the 20th century, it began to see the leaders of the country, I think based on that Lutheran tradition of a two kingdoms teaching, which I know also is part of a Catholic tradition, but the idea that the church has the kingdom of the word and not the kingdom of the sword. That's the government. And they should be separate. So an idea of a secular state arose very early in Norway, and that the state had dominion over that. And it was just as much God's work as the regiment or the kingdom of the Bible or the word. And so I think linked into this is the idea that Norway was a very poor country for most of the 20th century, the beginning of the 20th century. Not something we think about today. Prior to the Second World War, it was sort of a lower middle class country, and then the Second World War decimated it. And then the 60s, they found oil. And here is a very interesting sort of history for Norway compared with other countries, where oil for many countries is a curse. I was speaking to a group of pastors in northern Nigeria a few years ago, and I shared with them this idea of how oil is a blessing for Norway. And they said, how? Because for us, the big oil companies came in, they paid lots of money to our leaders, and we see nothing of it. Our country is poorer now than it was before oil was found. How have you done this? And the simple fact was they had leaders who had strong sense of moral code and ethics that said, we will not allow a few of us to get rich before the entire population benefits, because the riches belong to everyone. And I think that's part of that strong Protestant Christian tradition. And not to say that Catholic traditions don't have it or Orthodox traditions don't have it, but for them, that Protestant work ethic that was promoted by some lay preachers who were actually put into prison back in the 17 and 1800s because they weren't ordained, but they were preaching a gospel that said, we believe in the afterlife, but we believe also God wants us to work hard in this life. And that culture had developed throughout Norway, and also sort of it was even in a secular sphere. And so when Exxon and Shell and British Petroleum came knocking on the door and said to the leaders of Norway, we're going to help you. We will take care of everything, and we will make sure you're taken care of. The leaders said, screw you, excuse my language, but we will not allow that to happen. here's what's going to happen. You will come in and you will provide training for our people. You will invest in our university, so we have engineers, we have geologists, geophysicists, and we will license the offshore area. We will not sell it to you so you own it, but we will license it for long periods of time, and then we will build up our infrastructure. And I think that idea, Norway was able to grow exponentially and become rich, and it kept that down-to-earth way of thinking. And part of that has to do with, again, this Protestant tradition, which had a term which in Norwegian is janteloven. A strange word, but it means you're not better than anyone else. And children were brought up with the idea that you should not think that you're better than somebody else. Now, in its most extreme form, it denigrates children and they get a negative picture of themselves, but in its most positive form, it just says, you're not worse than anybody else, but you're not better than anyone else. We're all equal. And that sort of has contributed to not just thinking in terms of Norway, but thinking of the world in general. And because of the riches they've been blessed with, they want to then benefit the rest of the world. So back to your question, which I've now expanded on. So Norway has very early been an adherent to the Universal Declaration of Human Rights and the global human rights movement. Now, it hasn't always been a champion of freedom of religion or belief. And if I can be a little bit bold and a little bit egotistical about our organization, I think we were one of the ones who pushed the government. In the early 2000s, we recognized that there were increasing attacks on religious communities, minorities around the world, and we felt the Norwegian government should also have a focus on this. They had a focus at that point on women's rights, on gender, on human rights defenders, on freedom of speech, and a growing, burgeoning focus on the LGBTQI community. And we said, should we not also have a focus on freedom of religion or belief? Not to the detriment of those other rights, but in addition. And the answer from the Minister of Foreign Affairs back in 2004, 2005, 2006, 2007, when we approached them through the media directly and through the parliament, was we take care of freedom of religion or belief through our general human rights work. But then through a series of events, not the least of which the Danish cartoon controversy, which also was then published in Norway and also had repercussions for Norwegian embassies and other places, they recognized the potential, both the positive and the negative potential for religion. And so in 2012, the same Minister of Foreign Affairs announced freedom of religion or belief will be a new focus area for us. They created a guidelines that was sent to all their embassies on how to address freedom of religion or belief issues. They established a ambassador at large for freedom of religion or belief, and they established a fund within the Ministry of Foreign Affairs and in the Ministry of Development to provide aid to organizations that were doing development work in the area of freedom of religion or belief. So Europe is not a single thing, as you know. So it's there's no one sort of answer about what do I think about Europe, because the situation in England compared with Georgia is different than from Italy and Belarus. So by and large, I think Europe in general has a long-standing tradition, especially through the Council of Europe and the European mechanisms, the human rights mechanisms, for respecting human rights and freedom of religion or belief. We definitely see some cultural wars going on. I think the conference that we're at now is describing some of those cultural wars. But overall, I would say, compared to the areas where I do work, Pakistan, China, North Korea, Nigeria, Myanmar, India, the sort of small legal challenges to whether you can have a conscientious objection to providing healthcare benefits to someone who wants contraceptives, or marriage between same-sex people. Those are fine issues and have to be dealt with. But I'm dealing with issues of 14-year-old girls who are being abducted and forcibly married to 40-year-old men. In essence, being raped daily by their new husbands. And the court system does nothing. In fact, when it's brought up, the girl is able to escape. She's sent back with her husband, with the court saying, this is perfectly legal. I can't get excited about contraceptive issues. So not to say it's not important, but that's not my focus. When it comes to the challenges that I would see are grave, I would look at the situation in Belarus, for instance, with an authoritarian leader who is more and more, I would say, afraid of losing his power and is consolidating and closing down on all groups that can meet. And one of the challenges to any authoritarian leader are religious groups. They have a nasty tendency to meet together. And what do they talk about? That's a little bit frightening for an authoritarian leader, because maybe they're talking about things that could be a challenge to the authority. And so religious communities are in grave danger, and many of them are arrested, and my friends are arrested because of this. So there's a huge challenge. And I see some similar negative trends in some countries where there has been a clear separation between the majority religion and the government, but there's a closing of the gap and maybe a remarriage happening, which concerns me. Because while you can have a close relationship, as long as the majority religion isn't given advantages that the minority religions don't have, the tendency is often that the majority religion wants advantages, privileges. So there are some worrying trends that I see that could lead to gross abuses, more than those smaller ones that I talked about earlier. So the tension between majority and minorities is always a difficult one. And one quote that I'll use tomorrow as well, that I think back to, is attributed to Benjamin Franklin, and it says, "We should never allow democracy to become two wolves and one sheep discussing what to have for dinner, or voting on what to have for dinner." And that's the problem often with the majorities. They think because they have everyone with them, or mostly people with them, or they think, the leaders think they have everyone with them, that it's okay to suppress the minorities in some sense. And it's the job of the government, and most constitutional governments, to protect the minorities, which from the viewpoint of the majority could be looked at as their losing of privileges to them looks like they're losing rights. So I don't see it as a big problem. What I do see as a problem are divergent voices within the majority who are under threat. Because a majority is never a simple majority. There are diverse voices within any majority, and we would, well, all of Europe would be Catholic still if we didn't have divergent voices. And every group then has split off within itself, so from Calvinists to Lutherans to Methodists to Baptists, because you've had divergent voices. And this, unfortunately, during that portion of time in European history, there were bloody wars fought over this. The one group would demand the right to break away from the majority as their right to freedom of religion or belief, but it would not give the same right to another group that wanted to break off because of some other theological discussion. So I think, to be very blunt, I don't think the majorities in and of themselves are in danger. I think there's some tug of wars going on. There are some issues of privileges that are being taken away. But I think the divergent groups, divergent voices within the majority might have some problems. I've seen the tensions that exist between what I consider to be majority religious communities and some more groups that are talking about sexual orientation and gender identity. And those are issues that I think are natural, that are going to happen. I'm leery of the government siding with the majority just because it's the majority. Then you become the two wolves voting on what to have for dinner with the one sheep. I think we need to use the common principles that we all understand in the European Convention on Human Rights, and also even broader the conventions of the UN, especially the ICCPR, International Covenant on Civil and Political Rights. And I think using those guidelines that can help us navigate through those. But I'm afraid of identity politics playing too big of a role. And here's, as I alluded to earlier, when a majority religion links itself so close to the government wants to get legitimacy by linking itself to the religion, suddenly you have a national identity linked with a religious identity, then I think it's very dangerous for the religious minorities. Because people can then think that if you don't belong to our group, you have a divergent view, you're not really a good citizen. That frightens me. Yes, definitely. So that's why it frightens me so much, because I see it so clearly in Myanmar, for instance, where you have a movement within Buddhism. And again, take this very clearly. Most Buddhists are very peaceful people. But in Myanmar, you have a group called Ma Ba Tha, and it means for the protection of race and religion. In my ears, as an American, that sounds a lot like the Ku Klux Klan. And they not just discriminate, they kill Rohingya Muslims. It's mostly against Muslims, but also against Christians. Just recently in Chin State in northwestern Myanmar, pastor who, one of my staff knows him. The military came in to burn down a Christian village. He was trying to put out the fires and the military killed him, and then to get access to his ring they cut his fingers off of his hand. And this is, much of it is done in the name of religious identity, national identity linked with language, ethnicity, and with religion. Those three identity markers. We see the same thing with the BJP party in India, but more so with the RSS movement and other movements, the Bajrang Dal, the Shiv Sena, very violent, active groups that equate being a citizen of India with being Hindu. And if you're not Hindu, you're not a good citizen, and therefore you can be attacked. And again, Muslims and Christians are the ones that are most vulnerable in those situations. See similar tendencies in Sri Lanka. A friend of mine from Turkey who converted to Christianity, his father sat him down and said, son, how can you be a traitor to, not our religion? He didn't say that. How can you be a traitor to our country? So by changing his religion, he suddenly was no longer looked at as a Turk. So that's why it frightens me to see the same trends in Europe that I see other places in the world where there's lots of violence going on. So I don't think there is one. That's the first thing. I don't think there's one way. And I think that one thing we need to recognize, we need to right-size freedom of religion or belief. It's not more important than any other human rights, but it's not less important. So I've seen both ditches, if you will, as we walk along the path of promoting freedom of religion or belief. I see those who say that freedom of religion or belief is the first right, it's the only right, it's the right, foundational right for all other rights. I don't think that's helpful. On the other side, I see those who say, why do we even need freedom of religion and belief? The same rights are protected by all the other plethora of human rights. Actually, freedom of religion or belief just sort of muddles things and does damage. That's not the way forward either. I think we have to recognize that freedom of religion and belief is a central right. It is a fundamental right, but it's not more important and not less important than other rights. So that's number one. Number two, we need to recognize that human rights are also in a broader scheme of goods, public goods that need to be taken care of. So good governance. I'd like to say democracy, but I think, as we've seen in Europe, the road to democracy has gone through lots of different transitions. And I think asking countries like Saudi Arabia or Egypt or Myanmar to jump from a very authoritarian type of small rulers, small kings rule to full democracy is Pollyannish. It's not going to happen. We need to push towards good governance with the rulers that exist and hope for the strengthening of good institutions. And there I think human rights can be a good tool to use, and freedom of religion and belief a tool to use to build good, strong institutions. And building rule of law structures, not only for judges and lawyers, so we have institutions that help them, but also the police. Most places in the world, the police force aren't trained. They're just the local thugs who then can implement the wishes of the people, the elite who are in power. So thinking holistically that freedom of religion and belief is part of a human rights scheme, which is part of a broader scheme to bring about a place where people can thrive and flourish. And then in addition, I think we need to have a long-term perspective. I think I've met too many newly appointed ambassadors or parliamentarians from around the world who say, we're going to fix this. And they're thinking in terms of their 4-year term and they're going to do something overnight. I don't believe in it. Again, the transition that most of our Western European countries have come through has been long and arduous, and it's been a back and forth seesaw thing. I think the projects we need to support are those that are long-term projects that help build local resources so that people can, in a cultural context, strengthen those things that I just mentioned earlier, long-term. We need to be working with diverse actors. So, from a Christian organization, we need to be talking with Muslims. I can't come into a Muslim-dominated country and tell them how they should be doing things. But I can link up with Muslims who have a similar view. We agree on so many things, and I can help strengthen them so they can challenge the authorities where they are, or a Buddhist, or a Hindu. We need to include the broad spectrum. And here in Europe, we need to engage with like-minded secularists or atheists or agnostics also. from a religious community. Too often we've been in our own camps fighting with each other. So I believe in coalitions. I believe in cooperation. I believe that people working together can make a difference. People who know about their context. And then lastly, I think we need more ForB literacy. There are many misconceptions about what freedom of religion or belief is all about, and I'll talk about that more tomorrow. It's not about protecting religions. It's about protecting people. It's not about removing, as many of my secular friends would do, removing religion from the public sphere, but is allowing a level playing field for religion to also be at the table, even with secular voices and non-religious voices, and a number of other things. So we need to train people in what it means actually for full freedom of religion or belief for everyone. Yeah, so the sessions I've attended so far, for me, have been very geared toward an American and a European sort of perspective. So as you've heard, my perspective is a bit broader. So I hope that I can contribute to expanding the vision of the battle we have for promoting freedom of religion or belief. And as I mentioned, while I recognize everyone lives in their own context and we have to fight for the rights and we have to continue to find ways in which we can promote and strengthen the rights of everyone, what I've seen so far, the European, the American context, aren't as egregious for me. Now, the last person I just heard talking about a history of freedom of religion or belief, and including John Locke and the Reformation and the 30-Year War, I find fascinating. And I think, for me, it has applications when we're dealing with other parts of the world. In terms of what I'm going to be presenting, I think I've touched on bits and pieces of it. And I think freedom of religion or belief does challenge. It challenges religious hegemonies. It challenges secular leaders. And it is challenged also by other human rights. So the intersectionality of rights, one of the things that we are focused on most recently, and we just had a launch of our latest booklet, a little bit of a commercial, freedom of religion and belief, focus on women. Too often in our world of human rights, the default for human rights abuses has been the man. It's been a male perspective. And we've missed half of the world who are suffering. And so we need to have also a focus on how women suffer. And in the field of freedom of religion or belief, the type of abuses that women suffer are different than what men suffer. So men's suffering often is a very public type of suffering. They might be killed, but they have the advantage when they're killed. They're often a martyr for their local community. They're looked at as a hero. They might be thrown into prison. Women are seldom murdered, but they're much more likely, 95% of the abuses against women have to do with sexual violence, with rape, which then doesn't make them a hero. It stigmatizes them. So now they're not only have been abused, but then they might be abused by their local community who looks at ideas of purity wrapped up in the female sexuality. So she's then excluded from her community and is doubly then abused. And we have not focused on that enough. So looking at the intersectionalities, how other rights coming into contact with freedom of religion challenges it to meet the needs of other peoples. And then lots of other things which I don't have time for because then I'd have my whole lecture going right now, which is supposed to last 45 minutes, which would be too much. I always think that exchanging ideas is a good idea. I'm a big fan of meeting together, chatting together, and I think being in the same room together, learning new things, talking with people creates synergies. So I definitely believe in it. I would distinguish between those conversations that will help those challenges that are going on in European society. I'm pretty sure that'll help. That's not where I'm going to engage myself much. But I can definitely see some of the people I've met already who could be interesting people to talk with about some of the broader challenges, the more egregious challenges that we meet in other parts of the world. So I'm a fan of these type of things. I think it's a very good thing.